Right, hello everyone. So, as Jacob has actually introduced, I'm Marc Tamlyn. I am a core contributor, and I am a serial giver of talks entitled What's New in Django 1.x. So, it seemed an appropriate thing to do for a Django birthday to do the box set edition of What's New in Django 1.x. And so I'm going to attempt to give 10 talks in 20 minutes. So everything's going to go by quite quickly. The slides will be online if you want to look up any of the details. And frankly, everything is in the release notes. So there's no questions. Going with a slow look in the release notes is the answer to every question. So we shall start way back in time with Django 1.0. I didn't start any earlier than this because there were no release notes before Django 1.0, so it was quite hard to compile the list. There was the blog, but it's not quite the same. So we started in September 2008. This was 18 months after Django 0.96 came out. There's a lot of changes, the biggest number of changes in any of the versions in terms of commits, although not in terms of lines. And the 4 names you see at the bottom of each of these slides are the people with the most commits in that version. I'm not going to sort of touch on who those are, but you can see them for your own interest. So the question is, what was new in Django 1.0? Well, the short answer is everything. Before Django 1. To those of you, let's go have a quick show of hands. Who used Django before 1.0 came out? That's a much higher proportion than there would normally be at one of these events. Well, for those of you with shorter memories who can't quite remember, here's some of the stuff that came out in 1.0, which basically makes Django look like it does now. We had Unicode by default. We had template auto-escaping. The query set refactor landed that basically rewrote the LRM and made it make sense, kind of. We added contrib.gis, we added storage backends so you could store a file somewhere other than the local file system. We ditched old forms, which was a good decision, and we pretty much rewrote the admin from the ground up. Not everything that was announced as a major good feature in the old versions of Django was necessarily the right direction. My 2 favorite things that deserved headline mentions in the release notes for 1.0 were a complete rewrite of contrib.comments to make it generically useful for everybody, and supporting for Jython, which also didn't really last. My favorite thing about giving talks like this, where you do the what's new in Django 1.x, is you find all the little things that either aren't mentioned in the release notes or just deserve a tiny little notice. And with some of the old ones like this, it's you can't even imagine them not being there anymore. So not featuring as in the 1.0 release notes, but added in 1.0, are the paginator, the decimal field, the ability to access your response headers by dictionary access rather than by some obscure access that they used to be. And when you load from the database, instead of getting an assertion error, you get multiple object returned, which actually makes sense. So Django 1.0 was pretty awesome. We then moved on to Django 1.1. We're 10 months further down the line here in July 2009. Django 1.1, it's got a pretty big diff stat here. Quite a lot of it is documentation. A lot of Django 1.1 was chasing up things that weren't quite as finished as they could have been in 1.0. That's not to say that there weren't some awesome features, though. In particular, we added the support for aggregates, both in GIS and not in GIS. We added the F object. That's one of those things I can't imagine not being there, having not used before Django 1.1. We added unmanaged models and proxy models, added actions for admins, and probably one of the most significant things that's ever happened to Django's test suite, and test suites written for Django, was actually using transactions and rolling it back at the end of every test. The release notes stated that this gave a 10-fold speed increase to Django's test suite, which is quite dramatic. There's one big new feature in Django 1.1, which I think is pretty much universally disliked, which is URL namespaces. They do what they do, but they don't do it in the nicest way they possibly could do. But they are useful, I suppose. The only kind of little thing I could find in Django 1.1 that is definitely, I can't imagine that not being there, is the empty tag to a for loop. Little tiny thing, but I use it so often. So, let's move on to Django 1.2. We're now in May 2010, another 10 months later. So what is new in Django 1.10? Well, in my opinion, the most exciting thing that happened in Django 1.2 is me, because I started using Django here. So this is as far back as I can go. So these are all releases that I actually remember these things being new and exciting. So Django 1.2 introduced the support for more than one database in your project. And that's not a database agnosticism, that's actually having 2 databases, whether they're the same or not. It added the contrib.messages framework, which is very heavily used. I think that had something like 78% of people on the recent survey said they use contrib.messages. We added email backends, and we rewrote CSRF so it actually does CSRF. There are two spectacular lines that I'm quoting from the 1.2 release notes here, which didn't quite mean what they read like. As a side effect, it's now much easier to support non-Django template languages. Took us a little while to get there, and a foundation for specifying permissions at the per object level has been added. What this actually meant was there was a hook in the admin change view where you could override the permissions. That was the only place there were any hooks. It's not really quite the same thing. The first one we've now solved, the second one we haven't. Probably the most useful little thing that was added in Django 1.2 is what was entitled the smart if tag. So the if tag actually understanding less than symbols and double equals and useful things like that. So it feels a little bit more like you're actually writing Python in it. The fail-fast parameter to manage.py test, which allows it to stop after the first test failure. And the cache template loader, which got a tiny little one-line mention halfway down the 1.2 release notes and is now recommended in every single Django install. So what was new in Django 1.3? We're now up to March 2011, 10 months later again. And you see the team is starting to change a little bit here, of who's doing the work. Bit of a European invasion going on. So 1.3 was actually one of the smaller releases in terms of major features that came out. There were two really, really big ones, which are contrib.static files and the introduction of the class-based views. I've not put the class-based views on the dead end because I think they're awesome, although I think some people may have done in the way they were worded in 1.3 at least. The other thing that was added was the settings.logging stuff, which allows, there wasn't actually, adding settings.logging was not that exciting, but there was a bunch of stuff that happened behind the scenes to get logging actually used properly throughout all of Django. Probably the biggest dead end, mainly because I was trying to remove it recently and it's quite hard, is validation error. Management form data is missing. This is actually not a problem to throw a validation error here. The problem is it throws the validation error on form set initialization, not on form set clean, which means that if you've got any web page with a form set on and a spider posts a empty post tick to it, then you get a 500, which is not really very helpful. Little things that came in, the include tag got pretty supercharged. You could specify which environment variables you want, which context variables you wanted to pass into it. We added the request factory for tests rather than just the test client. Functions were now consistently called in templates. Before Django 1.3, if you wrote a something.method name, then it would call the function, but if you just put a function name in, it would print out bound function, which was probably not what you wanted. And we added the render shortcut, so you didn't have to faff about with request context every time you wrote render to response. Django 1.4. We're now in March 2012. Django 1.4 had the longest release cycle, an enormous positive diff stat, like 160,000 lines there, and was probably the most significant version in terms of number of big features that we've ever released. There's a good reason why this was the LTS. It's an amazing release. That said, it still, in my opinion, has one absolute outstanding feature, which is time zones. Without time zones are a nightmare. Everybody hates time zones, and Django actually makes them manageable. That said, I've got a whole nother page of big features that came out in 1.4. The RM got bulk create and prefetch related, two super useful efficiency features. We updated the project layout so you don't get duplicate import paths anymore. We updated the password hasher so it actually does something that's not just SHA-1. We added the live server test case that allows you to use Selenium or other in-browser testing frameworks and actually added some in-browser tests to the admin. We added the wsgi.py, so we're actually like a proper citizen of the web community. And we added sensitive post parameters, which is another really important security feature. The one thing we possibly shouldn't have been quite so excited about was the new form wizard. So form wizard in form tools got rewritten. This only lasted 2 versions, I think, before we ripped form tools out altogether. It's still knocking about. I think some people use it, but not many. Again, I could have written 4 slides that with this title, the little things that came out in 1.4, assert HTML equal, the elif tag, how did we write templates without that? The reverse lazy, when you get a 500 from an AJAX request, it returns it in plain text rather than HTML. That's probably less important these days than it was when 1.4 came out, because dev tools in browsers are better, but still pretty useful. We added the distinct on, which obviously only works in Postgres, because it's the only one that really understands distinct on, but it's still pretty useful. And possibly my favorite ever little thing that makes your life better as a Django developer, which is manage.py helps output being grouped by app. Which is a tiny little change, but it makes such a difference when you're trying to work out what's what. So we then move on to Django 1.5. This is 11 months later, so still a pretty long release cycle. You can see this is almost an equal level diff for the first time, which is quite exciting. Almost as many lines removed as were added. And the reason why this diff stat is quite so high is because there was one major change, which is the addition of Python 3 support. It was listed as experimental, but it pretty much actually worked in 1.5. There were a few bug fixes by about 1.5.2, and then it was still recommended not for production, but it wasn't that far off. We added the streaming HTTP responses. We added the pluggable user model, which does what it does. It's still awkward, but it does work. And we added the update fields parameter to save, which is something that I use very, very regularly, especially in queued tasks. It's very useful for that. So at this point, I start struggling on this page. Either this means that we're getting much better at not releasing things that are dead ends, or it just means that we haven't been using these versions long enough to know that things are a bad idea yet. I'm inclined to suspect it's probably the latter, although I'll hope it's the former. 1.5 did still have some awesome little extra things in. The login URL now and logout URL and so on accept URL names rather than actual paths. You could always use like reverse lazy to do it, but it's much nicer to just put the URL name in. My personal favorite feature in 1.5 is the promotion of the slugify function from only a template filter to an actual text function. The reason this is my favorite feature is not because it's an awesome feature, but because I wrote it. That was my first significant contribution. So the template language understood true and false and none. We added index together. We added request.body instead of request.raw post data, which was a name that made no sense. We added the clean, and we kept clean data knocking around on invalid forms so you can actually do something with it later. We now move on to Django 1.6. We're another 9 months later, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice something quite exciting here. Django 1.6 had a negative diff stat. The reasoning for this is primarily because we removed local flavor from core at this point. But nonetheless, the fact that it has a 180,000 line negative diff stat is pretty useful for anybody who's ever trying to download Django. At this point, I do need to pause and mention that Django 1.6 was released in honor of Malcolm Tredenick. Those of you who have been around for a long time, which is most of you, will be aware that a lot of the stuff that happened in 1.0 and 1.1 release cycles was largely done by Malcolm. He rewrote a huge amount of code originally written by Jacob and Adrian and made it absolutely amazing. He was a brilliant person, immensely active with the support on Django users, and I'm very sad that I never got to meet him. Moving on, Django 1.6 had some really, really good developments. We added the Discover runner, which a lot of people have been using as an external project for a little while. We rewrote the transaction management so that it actually made sense on all the databases. So it was the introduction of transaction.atomic. We added persistent database connections, which saves about 50 milliseconds off everybody's request ever. We finally ditched pickle session serializing as the default and replaced it with JSON, which made Alex extremely happy. We made model saving not do a select first every time, which saves one round trip to the database every time you save a model, which is probably a good idea. And we added the checks framework, which was originally there to sort of check compatibility between Django versions. It's not worked out so well for that, but it's really useful for checking configurations. And there's a check -- deploy these days, which makes sure that all of it you run with your production settings to make sure that you've got all the things turned on that you should have turned on, like debug turned off, for example, and all the various like HTTPS things that you might want turned on, and points you to references in the documentation about it. Little things that happened, we added queryset.first and queryset.last, which do sensible things, as you would hope them to do. We used HTML5 input types, apart from for numbers, because HTML5 number input types make no sense. We added the deployment checklist to the documentation, which actually tells you all the things you ought to do when you're deploying your first Django site. And we made the admin preserve the filters on the list, on the change list page when you've gone in to edit something and come back, which is one of those things that makes all the people who use the Django admin very, very happy. Django 1.7. We're 10 months further on here in September 2014. There is an obvious feature that landed in Django 1.7, thanks to someone sitting right over there, which is the migrations framework. White page. But that was by far not the only awesome thing that happened. We also did added prefetch objects. It makes prefetch related more usable. You can specify custom query sets and so on. The ORM got the ability to specify custom lookups and transforms. We added queryset.asManager, so you don't have to duplicate as much code when you're writing a manager. We improved the way that form errors work, so that all the ones produced by Django generate a certain code so that you can inspect them programmatically. And the app loading refactor finally landed, which I did an entire talk on the app loading refactor at some point. It was ticket 3591, if I believe, which had been around for some time, and eventually AMRIC managed to get it to work, and it means that Django now has a consistent, believable startup sequence so that everything gets imported in the right order and everything works, and it's got a bunch of useful hooks, so you don't have to put random stuff in models.py for no good reason anymore. Bunch of little tiny useful things that came in 1.7. Form.clean doesn't have to return its clean data anymore, which I forgot to do every single time I wrote a clean method. A couple of useful utilities for doing HTTPS. The scheme attribute got added to the HTTP request, so you could check what it had been requested with, and there was ability to mock that from the test client so that you could pretend to be HTTPS from the test client. We added the admin.site.register became usable as a decorator, so we added the customizability of the empty label on form choice fields. Django 1.8 came out in April 2015, on the 1st of April 2015, and is notable for two reasons. One, because it's the second version with a negative diff stat, and two, because it is the only version of Django ever to be released on time. At this point, I need to say thank you very much to Tim for his amazing work as the Django Fellow, and without him working as the Django Fellow, we would have no chance of ever having released a version on time. It was released on April the 1st, which also appeals to my sense of humor. Django in 1.8 had some pretty awesome features. We added contrib.postgres, we added UUID fields and time delta fields, duration field to the core, so that worked on only really work well, if you like, on contrib.postgres, and in the case of time deltas on Oracle, but they mock well enough, and there's some lovely code that makes adding time deltas and date times make sense on all the different database backends. We integrated the external project called Django Secure, written by Eric Rumjin, which is pretty useful. There was an enormous patch that was committed under the hood, the 2,000-line patch in the RRM, which rewrote the way expressions worked and allowed there to be such a thing as customizable expressions. The model.meta interface got publicized, so actually made into an actual interface with an API, and that is now documented. We finally got this support for multiple template engines that were mentioned in 1.2, and in the spirit of speeding up your tests, we added the setup test data function that allows you to, I use it all the time now. If you haven't been using 1.8 much, check it out, it's extremely useful. Nobody likes waiting for their test suite to finish. Lots of other useful little bits and pieces here. We fixed the default max length on a whole bunch of fields that people have been moaning about us since about Django 1.0, the length of email fields and these kind of things, which was now possible thanks to having a migrations framework. We added the refresh from DB command, method rather, on a model instance, which is another thing people have been asking for a long time. We added support for microseconds in MySQL, because MySQL now supports microseconds. Welcome to the 21st century. A lot of the negative disk stat in 1.8 actually comes from contrib.gis. The improvements in the RRM that made contrib.postgres possible also make contrib.gis not anywhere near as much of a nasty hack as it used to be. The RRM is becoming increasingly extensible with every version at the moment, and as a result, every version we're deleting a few 100,000 lines from GIS, which is really good. There's a lot of a lot more care is taken with the model types used in the RRM. So if you try and put the wrong sort of model in a query or as the attribute, it will go, no, you can't do that, rather than just blindly taking the primary key of that model and assuming that you did the right thing. And there's 3 really useful attributes added to the manage.py test command. One to keep the database knocking around between versions, one to run them in the reverse order so you can check for leaky state, and debug SQL, which when a test fails will output the SQL commands that happened inside that test to the console. So we finally made it to talk 10. Thank you, Jacob, for finishing slightly early, so I have a little bit more time than I thought I had. So what's new in Django 1.9? Well, obviously this talk is unfinished. Django 1.9 is scheduled to be released on the 1st of December-ish, 2015. We will see when it happens. But it's more likely to be on time than recently. There's already a whole bunch of useful stuff that's landed, although feature freeze is not until September, so plenty of time to write more awesome stuff tomorrow. Stuff that's already landed, we now have a password validation framework, so you can specify that your password is not allowed to be your username, and other useful things like that. We have permissions mix-ins, which is been around for a while in Django braces, and we've merged the implementations from Django braces into contrib.auth for class-based views. There's a signal that's fired when a transaction commits. Contrib.postgres has gained a JSON field, and if I do my work properly tomorrow, we'll have a full-text search implementation as well. The Google Summer of Code project this year is looking at rewriting the way that URLs work, and it looks like it's going in a good direction, so that's promising. And as for the last 7 versions or whatever, when I've done this talk, composite fields might land. Little things that have come in, the test client now has a JSON attribute, JSON thing on its responses, which is really useful. Date lookups are chainable, so you can go year is less than whatever, rather than having to translate that into a date time in your head and work out what you're doing. The test client has a force login parameter, so you don't have to keep the plain password of all your test users knocking around. You can just go log in this user and it does the right thing. One of the things I've got mostly working is a test extensions system, which allows you to basically hook into the way that Django sets up the environment and rolls it back after every test. There should be a way of doing like, grab me a Redis database that doesn't have any data in it, roll it back after every test explicitly, rather than you having to write that yourself in every project. That's the plan. And obviously there'll be a whole load more little things, and I look forward to seeing what else is in the release when I inevitably give a 1.9 talk in a few months' time. I've been Marc Tamlyn. I live in Oxford in the UK, and I work for a little company called PhotoCrowd. If you're into photography in any sort of very serious nature, then check us out. Or just generally you like looking at really awesome photographs, because the quality of the imagery on the site is amazing. I'm not currently hiring, but I will be in a while, so come talk to me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.